It started on a Tuesday night, one of those dull evenings when everything feels a little too quiet. I was in my room, headphones on, scrolling through videos on my phone, when I heard my little brother, Jamie, calling out. His voice was muffled through the walls, but insistent, cutting through the low hum of my music. "Jake," he called again, louder this time. I sighed, pulling off my headphones. Jamie had just turned 7, and ever since he moved into the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall, he'd been waking up almost every night. Mom and Dad said it was nightmares or an overactive imagination, but I wasn't so sure. Jamie's wide-eyed descriptions of shadows moving in his room and whispers coming from his closet were a little too specific to ignore. "What is it now, Jamie?" I groaned, standing in his doorway. The nightlight cast a soft orange glow over his room, and he was sitting up in bed, clutching his stuffed rabbit. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the corner of the room. "He's back," Jamie whispered, barely audible. "Who's back?" "The man," he said, his voice trembling. I felt a chill creep up my spine. This wasn't the first time Jamie had mentioned the man. He'd started talking about him a week after we moved into this house. At first I thought it was just one of those imaginary friends kids make up, but the way Jamie talked about him was different. He wasn't playful or happy, he was terrified. "Where is he?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Jamie pointed to the corner near the closet. I glanced over, half expecting to see something, but it was just shadows, the kind of vague shapes cast by furniture in the dim light. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "There's nothing there," I said, stepping into the room. "It's just your imagination, buddy." "No, he's there," Jamie insisted, his grip on the rabbit tightening. "He's watching." I sighed, trying to sound annoyed to cover up the unease creeping into my chest. "All right, fine. I'll stay here until you fall asleep, okay?" Jamie nodded hesitantly, his eyes never leaving the corner. I sat down on the edge of his bed, pulling out my phone to distract myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt colder than it should have, and the shadows in the corner seemed darker, heavier. An hour passed, and Jamie finally drifted off. I stood up carefully, making sure not to wake him, and left the room. As I closed his door, I glanced back one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the corner, a faint, shifting outline. My breath caught in my throat, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Jamie's words in my head, "He's watching." The next night, Jamie woke up screaming. I bolted out of bed and ran to his room, finding him curled up under his blanket, sobbing. "Jamie, what happened?" I asked, kneeling beside his bed. "He was here," Jamie cried. He was standing right there. He pointed to the foot of his bed this time. I flipped on the light, my heart pounding. The room was empty, of course, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I hugged Jamie tightly, trying to calm him down, but inside, I was starting to freak out. "It's okay," I whispered. "It was just a bad dream." Jamie shook his head violently. "No, he's real. He said my name, Jake. He said my name." That sent a shiver down my spine. Jamie had always been scared of the man, but he'd never claimed to hear him speak before. "Well, what did he say?" I asked hesitantly. Jamie's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "You can't stop me." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, holding Jamie until he fell asleep again. That night I slept in his room, sitting in the chair by his bed. I didn't want to leave him alone, even though I didn't really know what I was protecting him from. Over the next few days, things got worse. Jamie refused to sleep in his room, so he started camping out in mine. He wouldn't stop talking about the man, describing him in eerie detail, tall, thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Jamie said he wore old, tattered clothes and that his voice was low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. I tried to reassure him, telling him it was just his imagination, but I didn't believe it anymore. Strange things started happening around the house. Doors creaked open on their own. Lights flickered, even though the wiring had just been updated before we moved in. I'd hear faint whispers at night, just on the edge of hearing, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, I decided to set up my phone to record in Jamie's room. I figured if I could prove there was nothing there, maybe he'd finally calm down. I set it on his dresser, pointing toward the bed, and let it run overnight. Jamie was asleep in my room again, so the room was empty. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and checked the footage. At first, it was just hours of nothing, an empty room, the faint hum of the nightlight, and the occasional creak of the house settling. But around 3:15 a.m., the screen flickered. For a moment, the room looked darker, like a shadow had passed in front of the nightlight. Then, in the corner by the closet, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint ripple in the shadows. But then it grew, taking shape. A figure emerged, tall and thin, just like Jamie had described. It stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, its hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. And then, in a single jerky motion, it turned its head toward the bed. Even though the bed was empty, I swear I saw it smile. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. This wasn't just Jamie's imagination. The man was real. I didn't tell Jamie about the video. I didn't want to scare him more than he already was. Instead, I showed it to Mom and Dad. They brushed it off, saying it was probably just a trick of the light or a glitch in the recording. They didn't believe me, no matter how much I insisted. But I couldn't ignore it. That night, I stayed awake, sitting in Jamie's room with the lights on, armed with nothing but a baseball bat. I didn't know what I was planning to do if the man showed up again, but I couldn't just do nothing. Around 3 a.m., the room grew cold. The night light flickered, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There he was, standing in the corner. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. He took a step toward me, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. His mouth opened, and a raspy voice filled the room. "You can't stop me," he whispered. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Jamie was awake, standing in the hallway, his face pale with fear. "Did you see him?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. From behind the closed door, we heard the sound of something scratching against the wood, slow and deliberate. We didn't sleep that night. The next day, I did some research on the house. It turned out that the previous owners had moved out after their young son died in that very room. The official cause was listed as sudden illness, but rumors online suggested something darker. Neighbors had reported strange noises coming from the house, and one of them claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in the window late at night. I knew then that we couldn't stay. I told Mom and Dad everything, begged them to believe me. It took some convincing, but after another week of Jamie's sleepless nights and my growing paranoia, they finally agreed to move. On our last night in the house, Jamie woke me up. "He's in the hallway," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I grabbed his hand and we ran to Mom and Dad's room. As we shut their door behind us, I heard a soft, raspy whisper from the hallway. "You can't stop me." We left the next morning. I don't know who or what the man was, but I'll never forget those hollow eyes or the way the room felt when he was near. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about him. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I hear whispers in the dark. and sometimes,